All right, so what we're going to do now is start pivoting to look at Unit 3, the unit after the midterm. What we are going to do is talk about civil liberties. And those, as you may recall, we learned about before the midterm as part of our introduction to the judiciary. However, I'm placing them after the midterm for the purposes of this review because specifically of that First Amendment, right? Because the First Amendment protects certain rights or liberties, right? They're negative rights, what we often call liberties. It protects them in a way that is really relevant to post-midterm material. So that's why I'm putting it at this point in the review. So let's take a look. So what exactly are civil liberties? Right? They are limits on government power. They are protection from the government. Basically, there are negative rights. Again, remember, negative rights limit government power. So they differ from civil rights in that civil rights are positive rights. They obligate the government to give us something. Civil liberties obligate the government don't obligate the government to do anything, prevent the government from doing something, right? So civil rights are protections given by the government. Civil liberties are protections from the government. Most of these rights and liberties actually are written in the Bill of Rights. And remember, that's because our civil liberties can be considered negative rights. That's why it's in the Bill of Rights. So what liberties do we have? We have all sorts of liberties. The ones that are really important for our purposes this half of the semester are our First Amendment freedoms, specifically the right to free speech and the right to a free press. Now you notice those are only 2 of the 5 First Amendment rights. We've talked about the other First Amendment rights in Review 2 when I talked about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But those 2 are really important. And we know that most speech is protected by the First Amendment. For example, hate speech is typically protected. And much speech, really basically all political speech is protected. The only time speech becomes not protected is when it does something particularly bad, usually something that is actually a crime. For example, speech that is meant to defraud is fraud and therefore bad, right? It's not protected because it's a crime in that way. Speech that incites violence, that causes a clear and present danger of violence, is not protected. It could be prosecuted after the fact for inciting violence. So those are 2 of the big types of speech that are not protected. We also see libelous speech or defamatory speech is not protected, right? If you libel or slander someone, you can be sued. So that type of speech is not protected. However, most political speech is protected, and it is often very difficult to prosecute people or sue them for speech, even if that speech seems to fall in an unprotected category. Right? Some of this, to an extent, actually relates to a different type of unprotected speech, obscenity. Right? What's the difference between obscenity that is unprotected and just things that we think are sort of lewd and distasteful? Well, as the Supreme Court has said, we'll know it when we see it, right? Not exactly a clear boundary there. We often see that speech is really determined on a case-by-case basis. What incites violence in one scenario might not incite violence in another scenario, right? I think I used in class the example of shouting fire in a crowded theater. That is typically unprotected, but if I had been giving my lecture in a crowded theater, but if I had been, and I had decided in the course of the talk on free speech, and in that context, I decided to shout fire, that clearly would not have incited panic, right? Because that would have been part of a lecture on free speech. It would have been very obvious I had not meant that there was a fire and that people should be getting up and running away. So in that context, it would have been protected. right? So that is what makes this often a very difficult thing to talk about because where these lines are drawn often is on a case-by-case basis. That is typically why we don't see speech prohibited in advance of speaking or the press limited before they publish. That is why typically these are punishments after the fact, right? You can't stop someone from saying something that will incite violence. You can punish them after the fact. The hope is that if we punish people for incitement after the fact, people will stop inciting violence, right? If you know you're going to get punished, you're probably not going to say it. But we can't actually stop people from saying it. And we can see that sort of trying to stop people by, knowing they'll get punished if they say it is oftentimes how criminal law works, right? It's a deterrent. But in some cases, it can actually cause a chilling effect. That's why there are so few restrictions on the media and why it is so hard to do things like sue the media for libel. Because if they're always concerned about these libel suits, which for a small newspaper could mean the difference between being able to keep publishing or going under, they're just not going to risk it, right? They would rather not run a potentially important story about maybe public corruption for fear that a lawsuit would drive them out of business. Because even if they know it's true, truth is a good defense for libel, maybe they're wrong. Maybe they really thought it was true, but they messed up. Now, if they messed up because they did not uphold journalistic norms, and they actually published the story really just to do damage, then they can still be in trouble. But if they tried, if they did their due diligence, they really thought this was a story the public needed to know, and that's why they were publishing it, it would be almost impossible for a public figure to sue them for libel, even if the story did turn out to be untrue. And the reason for that is because we don't want a chilling effect. We don't want newspapers who've done their due diligence, or other media outlets who've done their due diligence, to be afraid to publish stories about public corruption or other issues that voters have a need to know, right? So that's why we do it, to make sure that the media can still inform the voters. So again, the vast majority of restrictions are of punishments are after the fact, not restrictions before the fact. So, as you've seen, this has a lot to do with the media. The media, if you may recall, started out as a party press. That meant that the vast majority of the media was actually controlled by political parties, right? It was the most cost-effective solution at the time. But once it became cheaper to print newspapers, the press broke away from the party because that became the better business model. And we had a corporate press. So the relationship between the press and the government is often quite fraught, right? The press needs the government. They need access. How else are they going to publish stories? And the government needs the press, because how else are they going to get their word out, especially prior to things like Twitter, right? These are very recent developments, social media. But without that, how are they going to get their message out? Are we really going to, even with Twitter, are we really going to follow 435 Congress members plus 100 senators plus the president plus? No, we're just going to let the press sort of tell us what's really important and what we need to know. So the government needs the press. But the problem is the press basically wants to uncover government malfeasance and corruption and stories with shock value, right? Things that are going to make us want to read the newspaper. And those don't tend to be everything's going great stories, right? So they want to uncover dirt. The government obviously does not want the press to uncover dirt. They want the everything is going great stories. So even though they both need each other, they want very different things out of the relationship, which can make this relationship very, very tense, and actually can even resemble a prisoner's dilemma at times. Now, the media, of course, has, because of this relationship, because they are the conduit for political information for most people, that's how we learn about politics. they have a lot of power over what we learn and how we learn it. So they can frame a story. This basically means they can tell us how to think about a story. They can also prime us. Priming triggers us to consider certain certain issues or candidates or events based on our own predispositions about certain issues, basically about how these things were framed. And so I will, let me get that a little clearer, because I know that that sort of sounded very interrelated, those two definitions. I'm going to give an example. So when you frame a story, when the press frames a story, they just tell us how to think about it. So let's take the Black Lives Matter protests. The certain media outlets may have framed it as, look at this wonderful show of peaceful protests, our First Amendment rights are, being borne out on the streets of New York. It's and across the country. It's wonderful to see these peaceful protests and these protesters talking about social justice and exercising their First Amendment values to assembly and speech, right? Or it could have been framed as these protests are risking super spreader events for COVID, because remember the recent Black Lives Matter protests were happening during COVID. They're risking super spreader events. They're causing violence. I mean, these riots and looting are springing up around these protests. They might have started out peacefully, but they have clearly gotten out of control, and we are risking violence and looting and property damage and even pestilence and disease, right? Obviously a very different frame. One of those frames, the first one was clearly positive. The other frame was clearly negative. And what that's doing, the different frames are telling us basically how to think about the Black Lives Matter protests. And if we don't know much about them and we haven't heard both frames, we're probably just going to accept whatever frame we hear, assuming it somewhat aligns with our worldview. Now, frames can be so powerful because they often tap into these primed predispositions, these ways that we then react to the information that is being given to us. So that first frame about how wonderful this is and our First Amendment values and peaceful protests, we are primed in this country to think positively about the Constitution and about our rights. So seeing these protests and hearing about them as people exercising their First Amendment rights, we are generally going to think good things about that story. So when we then think about the Black Lives Matter protests, we are going to judge them positively because we've been primed by these specific frames to bring positive emotions to view on this, positive predispositions. However, the second frame, the negative frame, the violence and looting and potentially COVID super spreader event frame, makes us bring negative predispositions to light, right? Different and very different ones. Humans are primed to think violence is bad, right? It makes sense. Self-preservation is, an innate human sense. We want to preserve ourselves. So violence we think of as very bad. Obviously, COVID super spreader event sounds pretty bad too for the same reason. And of course, looting, we generally, think, oh my gosh, I don't want my property damaged or stolen. That again sounds very bad, right? These protests are letting all that happen. This is terrible, right? So we are primed by, in that case, sort of nature to a large extent, to say that, wow, this is bad. I don't like these Black Lives Matter protests, right? So those different frames can bring very different predispositions to bear. And our primed reactions, therefore, will be very different, even though the event is the same event. Now, the last one, agenda setting, is the media actually telling us what even to look at all, right? They covered the Black Lives Matter protests a lot during the sort of peak summer of the pandemic, right? They were on all the time. So we probably thought a lot about them going into the 2020 election, right? Because the media kept talking about them. But there were other things going on, right, that we didn't hear about. So we didn't think about those things. And that's really important. The media can't talk about everything. They only have a limited amount of time. Even the 24-hour-a-day news channels, CNN, Fox News, those kind of channels, even they only have a limited amount of time. And let's face it, people are probably not watching the news at like 3 a.m. anyway. So they only have so much time. They just can't cover everything. And they also want to make sure that we want to watch. So they're not going to cover things that they think we don't care about. So by doing that, though, they are telling us what we should care about, because they're only telling us about some things. So we're not going to learn about those other things. So the media does have a lot of power to shape politics. And this power is very much protected by the First Amendment. As I've said, it's very hard to sue the media for libel. You have to prove, if you're a public figure and you feel you've been libeled, right, that the media has told an untruth about you, a lie, then you have to prove that they did so with actual malice. And this is a really hard bar to meet, to show that they disregarded journalistic norms and intended to harm you with this lie, right? So that is a pretty hard thing to prove, which means that the media is protected if they accidentally lie, right? If they really think they're publishing the truth, but it turns out it isn't. And obviously the media is protected if they tell the truth, because truth is a defense for libel, at least in the US, right? So you can't be sued for libel if what you are saying is true. Now, there is basically only one time when the media can be stopped from publishing something in advance of actually publishing it. This is called prior restraint, right? The government can exercise prior restraint on the media in the case of basically publishing troop movements. It's called the troopship exception. The media can't publish things that involve like troop movements, ship movements, that kind of thing, things that will put people in imminent danger and otherwise threaten national security. So in the past, the Progressive magazine was stopped from publishing the plans to build a hydrogen bomb. They had developed these plans not using any information that they shouldn't have. Basically, a guy who'd like taken physics classes and had looked at some declassified material had figured it out. But the government said, no, it doesn't matter that he figured this out using unclassified things. The information is born classified, should not be published, and we have to stop the publication because it could threaten national security. The court was pretty willing to go along with this, but then like a whole bunch of other people published basically the same thing. So it became a moot point. Once it was out there, it didn't really threaten national security anymore because it was already there, right? So those kind of threats to national security can sometimes be a really powerful tool for the government to stop things from being published, but there are limits. There was in that case, and of course there was in the case of the Pentagon Papers, right? The New York Times and Washington Post were ultimately allowed to publish the Pentagon Papers. So moving past this, what we're going to do is we're going to keep looking at politics in our next review.